Okay, now let's get into sequencing, which is a great new functionality of Discover. It allows you to order or enforce the order of certain criteria or containers. Before in Discover, you could search for multiple criteria within a page, visitor, but as long as all those criteria happened within that container, that would be included in your result set, no matter what the order was. And so now you can enforce the order. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples, and for these examples, I'm going to be looking at this scenario, which I'll also add to the page that I post this video on. And in essence, we're looking at 5 different visitors. Each of them come in on page A, and then within or under a minute, they go to page 2. And then some of them are under a minute, some of them are over a minute. They then see page C or D, and there's potentially 3 of these have then left at that time, but there's 2 others that have another period of time that lapse, and then there's a 4th page of C or D as well. So in most of our segmentation is going to be between pages 2 and 4 to see how what we segment on varies the results that we get. And I've kept this hovering at the top so we can always see it as we're doing the segmentation. So let's get started. Let's start with a simple one where we're looking at people who saw B and then C. I'm going to just stay here in the pages report because all of our examples and this test data I'm showing you is all page-based. But still keep in mind that you can also do this sequencing between other dimensions, other events, etc. You may want to look at people who are first-time visits and then purchasers. They were a social visitor and then a purchaser, maybe a purchaser and then a social visitor. There's all sorts of ways you could potentially use different dimensions or container scopes to get some interesting data. But today we're just going to look at a simple view of pages. So for the first example, let's say we want to look at people who saw page B and then page C within the visit or visitor. Right now we'll use visit because in the end, all these are first-time visits, and it doesn't really, well, for this data set, it doesn't really matter because each of these visitors just have one visit. It's test data like I mentioned before, so it doesn't really matter which one we'll do. So you can pick either one there. But we're going to look at those who saw page B and then C. So what I'm going to do is drag over the B container, and it automatically adds the criteria of page equals to B, and then I'm going to add C right below it. Now keep in mind that what I just added are not containers, they're criteria, so you can't necessarily put another criteria within a criteria. If you did want to somehow enforce some additional scope structure to this, you'd have to add a container and then the criteria, but right now this is just sequencing on criteria. And then within the and drop down here, we can then switch that to a then statement. So this will look for people who saw page B and then page C. And since we only have one visitor who did not see page C after B, we should be getting 4 visits and 4 visitors back. Keep in mind that for visitor Q, they saw page B, D, and then C. And so there was actually a page between these. So just keep in mind, this is very much like the traditional follow report, where simply we're segmenting on checkpoints, not necessarily a direct sequence here. Okay, so let's go a step further and look at those who then saw page D. Right, easy enough. All you need to do is just add that, and since we already had then selected within the criteria at the top, that is then carried through for the next container, and this would then give us those visitors who had page B, C, and D. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, you might have already seen me do this, but now within the data preview here at the bottom, you need to select this refresh icon to bring the data back. It doesn't just do it automatically. And so now we're limited down to one visitor. That would be visitor R here, who saw B, C, and D. Visitor Q, they did see all 3 of those pages, but not in the same sequence. So they are excluded from our segment. Interesting to note is that this is all probably very familiar with what you might get through a fault report, but the resulting segment turns out a little bit different. So if we just switch over to a fault report to look at that, we may add from our pages data, we may add the B, C, and D, but just keep in mind that the resulting report is going to look a little bit different. The cool thing about this recent release is they also add a create segment button to the fault report. So if you're much more comfortable with the fault report, you can start adding the sequencing there and then simply create select segment. By default though, it just adds those criteria to pages that are then within the parent container of visitor, depending on what you selected. So just note it's a little bit different with the fault report. It's a little bit more structured, and if you get into the segment builder, you can start breaking out of that and creating even more complicated scenarios. Okay, so let's go back to just our segment builder that's here from our the panel on the left-hand side, and go through a couple more examples I want to show you. So now let's talk about, or let's find visits who saw page B, then page C, but not page D. So in this case, we're going to add a container that's visits, and we want people who saw page B, C, but not D. Now, here you may be tempted to simply select, they saw page B, C, and then not D. When we create our segment, we need to also add the then criteria. Remember to adjust for our sequence. We're looking for people who went from B to C, and then where page does not equal D. Now, if you do this in order to match our question, which was visits that saw page B and then C, but not D, then this would be incorrect because, well, you can see here we don't have any data here, even though we see that visitor X and Y, those are two people who saw page C but did not see D. Unfortunately, what happens here is that after C there is no page. So simply by adding this requirement where a page does not equal D, you're telling Discover that you're still expecting a page, it's just a page not equal to D. So in the case of X and Y, they would not be included. Same reason for Q, because there is no page after C. And then for R, it would be more excluded for the reasons you would think, where there was C and then the page does not equal D. But if we want to get into our actual question of people who saw B, then page C, but did not see D after B, you actually want to add another outer container. What we'll do here is make the scope match what we had before. Like I said, with the data set, the visitor doesn't really apply, but in your analysis it may. And we'll exclude this container, add page B in, and then page D. And what this will give us is the answer to our question, which is people who saw page B and C, excluding those who saw page B and then D. And so that will take out, for example, Q and R, who are people that did see page C, but they also saw page D, which we now want them excluded from our segment. So as we refresh the data, we can see that we now have the two visitors, which would be visitor X and Y. Before we move on to some additional considerations, I want to point out what groups do in this scenario. You'll see on your left-hand side, if you haven't set these up before, groups right here under your pages are a great way to group any attribute. Basically, it's very much like an ad hoc segment or ad hoc classification, where you're saying, these groups of pages have this particular name. In this case, I have a group that includes page C and D. And when I drag this over, it'll simply add those criteria based on any and or then operators that already exist there. So in this case, it's going to look for the order of those two, whereas typically we'll use groups in a fault report to show somebody pathing from one page to potentially many pages, which is more of an or statement. So just note that when you're adding these groups, it behaves a little bit differently when you're putting them directly into the segment builder. Okay, next I want to talk about different logical groups. Now, let's say in our next example, we want to look at those who saw page B and then page C or D, right? So that would include everybody that's in all 5 of these visitors that are in our data set. Now, there's a couple ways we can do this. We could say, the page is one of, C or D. When we run that, we get all 5 visitors back because of what follows. We could potentially even add a page container here. Let's remove that and add page C or D right here and put the or statement there. And let's run this. Basically, this is telling us that we are looking for page B, and then we're looking for a page container where the page name is equal to C or D. And that would work too in this particular case. Now, what gets problematic though if you're doing this is if we then were to switch to an AND statement. So let's say we want to look at those people who saw page B and then they saw page C and D. So that would be our visitor Q and R here at the bottom. We're very interested in page C and D. You want to see who's looking at both of those afterwards. Now, if we were to refresh this particular scenario, we would get 0 visitors back. And why is that? Well, we're looking for one page that has a page name equal to C and D, which is just not possible. Every page is only going to have one page name, and so it starts causing problems for us within this particular segment. Now, this is where we can use a new functionality that's called logical groups. And you can see that here. Logical groups only appear when you're using a then criteria. You'll never see it in the parent container like you see up here at top. It's always going to be when there's a then, and you need to group elements together. Consider it, like in math when you use parentheses. It's kind of that, that operator or that container that will group criteria, whether it's specific page level criteria or visit level criteria. You can group, containers within this particular logical group. So what we can do here is change this container to a logical group, and now what we're saying, instead of a page where the page name is equal to C and D, we are now saying, give me back data, or give me back visits that saw page B, and then a page with page name equal to C and a page equal to D. So the then criteria is now looking for both of both of those following after page B. Now that we refresh this, we get those 2 at the bottom, visitor Q and R, that we're looking for, who saw page D and C, C and D. It doesn't matter the order when we're using the sequence operator here at the top with the logical group following that. Okay, great. So that's a great case for the logical group, and just be careful when you're trying to do or statements can sometimes work when you're using just normal containers or other criteria, but especially when you use and, more often than not, you'll probably want to go the direction of the logical grouping here.